Hey everyone, welcome to this Azure infrastructure update. And this is the end of May 2020. I release this bi-weekly, so every couple of weeks, covering the updates to Azure infrastructure. So between the last video I created, I also created a couple of kind of feature videos. There was an 80-minute video all about Azure cost optimization, things we can do to understand our costs, control our costs, optimize our costs. So go into detail there. I have a video actually using PowerShell with Azure functions and also interacting with Azure Storage, so blob and tables, all called via kind of a RESTful interface. And then also a video on using Terraform with Azure. This is a declarative technology. Now, normally we think about using ARM templates. That's declarative with Azure, but it only works with Azure. With Terraform, it actually works across clouds. Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, Kubernetes, VMware, many other providers. So I can use this singular technology across many types of service I want to interact with. So they're kind of just some key other things I created since the last update. So my focus feature for this video is actually the Azure Resource Graph, and this is phenomenal. This gives me the ability to get insight super fast, pretty much to any resource in Azure. I can just write a query, submit it, and I get my results. I have to have read access to the resource, for example, a VM or a disk, if I want to get it returned as part of the results. And when I run these queries, it will actually run across any subscription I have access to. So if I had access to 500 subscriptions, this single query would actually give me the results across all of them. And what's amazing is this is typically sub-second. Again, I have a customer that has 500 subscriptions. I can write a query to give me insight into some aspect, for example, find public IPs, find managed disks that aren't connected to a virtual machine, and it responds within a second. It uses KQL, so that is the Kusto query language. That's the same language we use with log analytics, so that's very familiar interaction. There are various tables that I can query. The one we're typically going to use is resources that, as the name suggests, will give us access to Azure resources. I'm going to query that table. And I can use it from the Azure portal, PowerShell, CLI, REST API. Now here you can actually see an example. I'm using the Azure Resource Graph Explorer. So that's actually in the portal. I'm just typing in my query and it gives me my results. In this case, the query is asking me for, well, any compute provider disks, which are managed disks, where they're managed by nothing, i.e. they're not connected. Then I'm returning the name, the resource group, subscription, location, SKU, etc. So this is finding me any managed disk in any subscription that I have read access to that's not being used by a virtual machine. Can help me optimize those costs. Here's another query I wrote in PowerShell. So I just store my query into a variable, my $graph search query. I then submit it using search AZ graph. There's actually an az.resources module that I install, and then I get my result. So super cool. Definitely recommend you go and check out the Azure Resource Graph. So let's look at the new features. So the compute side, actually fairly quiet. Really, it's ultra disks. So ultra disks are these phenomenally powerful disks, whereas normally my IOPS and my throughput and my capacity, they scale together. The bigger the disk, the higher the performance. With ultra disks, I have three different basically knobs I can turn. I can independently change my capacity, IOPS, and throughput. So I could have maybe only a terabyte disk throwing 160,000 IOPS at that thing. I can change them dynamically, so while the disk is running, change those dials for what I need at that moment. I optimize my cost. Maybe I'm running some batch job, I need huge IOPS, huge throughput. Well, I can change those dials. Job finishes, I'll turn the dials back down again and save myself the money. So now available in additional regions. Plus, I can now use a customer managed key for that server-side encryption. So I can bring my own key. That's very popular with many services. On the networking side, we now have the Azure peering service available. Now this really does a couple of different things. So ordinarily we think about kind of the Microsoft Edge, big backbone network, and all of the various Azure regions running Azure, running other types like Microsoft 365, Dynamics, etc., are connected to that backbone. Now there were also these kind of network edge locations, hundreds of them. And that's where Microsoft kind of reach out into like carrier hotels, points where all the different service providers, exchange providers come together. Things like this also enable meet-me's, maybe express route, but they're separate. They're not the same necessarily locations. Things like Azure Front Door, Content Delivery Network, they run out of these as well. And then we have exchange providers, service providers, some software-defined cloud providers, and they have their own networks. So you think that they have their network with their various points on it as well, and they have their connectivity. And there's the customer. And that last mile, we always think about, they use one of these kind of service providers. Now with this new Azure peering service, what is these partners, we work very closely with them. They have really good quality connectivity. They have kind of redundant connectivity. So you're going to get the shortest number of hops, the best performance. This is not express route. This is not a dedicated private connection. This is still essentially internet, but it's kind of the most optimal internet I'm going to get. I'm going to get onto that Microsoft network kind of as quick and with the fewest number of hops as possible. So you can go and sign up with these service providers. There's nothing to do on the Microsoft side, unless I also want certain telemetry passed to Azure. Maybe certain types of latency information, there's maybe any kind of hijacking going on or leaking, then I get that information. So I can optionally sign up to Azure as well, but it's really something you're working with your exchange or service provider to enable. So now I'm just going to get as best as possible connectivity to those internet facing services with the new kind of Microsoft peering capability. So that's kind of that new service. We also now have routing preferences available in certain services and certain regions. For example, public IP addresses, Azure Storage. And really this kind of relates back to that previous picture. And it's about, well, imagine I'm kind of at my location and then there's the internet. Now, ordinarily, I try and get on the Azure network as quick as possible. And so what would happen is if I was using a service over here, so this is the resource I actually want to get to, but this is me, what would normally happen is it will get you onto the Azure network as quick as possible, then go over our backbone to the resource. Maybe I don't want that. So what we now have is you actually have the choice. So what you could actually say is, look, I want to stay on the ISP's network as long as possible. So I will actually kind of now take this path. Imagine they had kind of maybe they have a connection there as well. And then, so I'll only get on the Azure network at the kind of the network edge pop that's as close to the resource as possible. Whereas normally I would get onto the network edge pop as close to Azure as possible. Now, generally you're going to get the lowest latency, the best performance if I get on the Azure network as quickly as possible. But there's lots of different cases, so at least now you have the choice. So for a public IP, for a storage account, I can pick my routing preference. Hey, do I just want to get on the Azure network, the Microsoft network as quick as I can? Or actually I want to stay on my ISP network and only jump onto the Microsoft network when I'm as close as possible to that Azure resource. So now you kind of have that choice. There is now private link support for the Azure Container Registry, so it can actually now be exposed through a private endpoint on my network. And the Azure Relay service, so remember this is kind of that change of what used to be the Azure Service Bus. So now there is an IP firewall support. So Azure Relay is all about taking something that's on my corporate network and making it available to the public cloud without having to expose kind of ports on my firewall. There's a component that runs on my network, establishes a connection outbound, and then I can do that two-way traffic. Now, ordinarily that is kind of secured through authentication. But now this IP firewall, I can also specify IP addresses, IP prefixes, and only allow those through. So you could imagine I could now be a lot more controlling and say, hey, look, only if it's coming from my on-prem these locations or this express route connection. And this has private link support as well. So that service that's now there, it can inject something into my virtual network, and that's how I interact with an Azure Relay namespace. Azure Storage, the Azure NetApp Files service now has a 4.9 SLA. And now there is a blob object level replication capability. So this is not when I turn on like GRS on a storage account. This is at a container level, I can create replication policies. So you could imagine I have a storage account. Let's say this is in kind of region 1, and I've got container 1 and container 2, and there's blobs in there. So what I can actually now do is I can imagine, well, look, there's another region over here, region 2, another region over here, region 3, different storage accounts of these regions. So there's container, and I can say, well, replicate that container over there, that container over there. So at container level, I'm setting that replication. It is async, so it's not synchronous. There's going to be some delay in that. But now at a container level, I can pick my own kind of replication for my blobs. So it's kind of a cool new capability. Next up, Azure Monitor actually has a bunch of new stuff. There are now over 250 example queries just built in to help me kind of get started. There's a new agent management experience, so I have to have agents on certain operating systems to get information. There's a whole new UI now built around that in the portal. There's an enhanced IntelliSense. So now you can think about suggestions. So I put in a table, and there's going to be suggestions of what the next clause will be. There's good descriptions of the tables that I'm accessing and the functions I'm going to use. So it's got better IntelliSense. There's now a soft delete for workspaces. So if I now delete a workspace, maybe accidentally, maybe saying maliciously did it, it's actually going to be kept. Now I can override that. I can say, no, I want it deleted. But by default now it's going to be kept. I think it's 14 days. So even if I delete the workspace, the data, the configuration will be kept. So I can kind of undelete it. And there is now private link support. So I can actually interact with that, again, through an IP address placed into my virtual network. Other stuff, major, we now have version 4 of the AZ module for PowerShell for Azure. So go and upgrade this. There is a new resource group and VM creation set of extensions for VS Code. So the resource group one, it lets me actually go and see my resource groups. I can create new resource groups. I can see the resources inside them. For the VM creation extension, I can now go and create Ubuntu Linux actual virtual machines. It sets up SSH for me automatically so I can quickly go and interact. There's now Azure policy for AKS in preview. So I can audit, enforce certain capabilities I want in my AKS cluster. And I can set these policies on pods, on namespaces, on the ingress. So I have all of those capabilities. Azure Backup now supports Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and it also has an Azure File Snapshot Retention capability. So if I take a snapshot now of Azure Files, again, I can protect myself from some accidental deletion or malicious deletion of that data. So it's actually going to keep those snapshots for a period of time. Then Azure Advisor Digest. This is actually pretty cool. I can go in and configure, hey, maybe weekly, monthly, I want to be sent a digest, so a summary of whatever categories I pick from Azure Advisor, like performance, cost, security, etc. And the way I target how I get that information is through action groups. So again, we use those very commonly against alerts. So that action group could have an email, an SMS, it could call the Azure app, it could call a webhook, it could raise a ticket in my ITSM. So I can now configure that as the target for my digest, and that will receive that summary of information. Also now, service health is now shown in the Azure portal. So rather than just having to go to kind of that Azure status page, it'll actually show in the Azure portal, easier to actually kind of go and get to. And so that is it for this week. I hope that was useful. If it was, please like, comment, subscribe, share. Until next time, stay safe and have fun with Azure.